Thanks very much for coming to listen to me today, and I also appreciate the Historical Society extending their invitation. It's really kind of enjoyable to come and talk to people who actually know who Vasquez is. He's very oddly, he's better known in Los Angeles County than he is up in Monterey County where he came from. But Tiburcio Vasquez was extremely well known during his lifetime, and he was one of the most infamous bandits of the Old West. His exploits, especially the last couple years of his life, were detailed in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times. When he was hanged, it was probably the most publicized hanging of the American West. And to this day, he's a Hispanic folk hero, as Alan mentioned. And I'll go into that in just a little bit. And there's a series of health centers in Alameda County called the Tiburcio Vasquez Health Centers. As you all know, the high school here in Acton is named after him, although they claim that it's not named after Vasquez. They claim it's actually named after Vasquez Rocks Park. I think that they want to distance themselves. Maybe after they read my book, who knows whether they'll change their minds or not. And then much of what's been written about him is myth, but Vasquez was a real person. People are constantly asking me, why don't you write a book about Joaquin Murrieta, who was the guy that Vasquez is often mixed up with. Joaquin was a so-called marauder of the mines. He was killed by the California Rangers in 1853, at which time Vasquez had already embarked on a criminal career. But contrary to myth, Vasquez was never part of the Murrieta gang. There's highly improbable that he knew Murrieta. And the difference between the two of them is that Joaquin Murrieta was far more bloody than Vasquez, and his career is completely enshrouded in myth. I always tell people it would take a governmental commission to try to separate the myth from the reality when it comes to Murrieta, but in this case, it was a one-man job. So this book, I started researching Vasquez when I was in high school. I've been collecting information on him for 41 years. It's a 500-page book, 70 illustrations. Most of this stuff in here has never been published before, and I'll talk a little bit about some of that in the next half hour or so, and then I'll be happy to answer questions. The book, I wanted to write more than just a biography of a bandit. He was a Californio. Californios were the native Mexicans who settled California, came up here with the De Anza expedition in 1776. And so this is the story of the rise and decline of the Californios. In many ways, it's a history of the early years of the state of California, encapsulated in the life of Tiburcio Vasquez, with lots of sex and violence thrown in, because that was his life, sex and violence, as you'll find out. The family came, the Vasquez family came with the De Anza expedition in 1776. At this point, California, for the most part, was completely unsettled. The Mexican government wanted settlers to settle it. I'm sorry, the Spanish government wanted settlers to settle it. So the family came up with the De Anza expedition. Tiburcio's great-grandfather was one of the founders of the city of San Francisco in 1776. His great-grandfather was one of the founders of the city of San Jose about 2 years later. They were a prominent family. They were impoverished. All of the peones, the poor people that came up from the northern frontier of Mexico, were very impoverished, and these were mixed race. Tiburcio Vasquez's grandfather is shown as a mulatto. He was part African, part Indian, and part Spanish. So he had the mix of the old world and the new world, and this is very typical of the Californios. If anybody sees a photograph of Pio Pico, the governor of California, he looks African Spanish. He has strong African blood. It's obvious from his photographs, even though he'd probably deny it back then. So Tiburcio was born in Monterey in April of 1835. The home he was born in is still standing behind Colton Hall. It's now the Parks and Recreation Department offices for the city of Monterey. And I got kicked out of there when I was writing the book. I just wanted to come in and see what it looked like, see how thick the adobe walls were. It's now got a second story and a little addition, but I wanted to actually go in the house and get a feel for how this family of 6 or 7 children lived in this little adobe. And they thought I was the Taliban or something. They wouldn't let me in. And so anyway, so my retaliation is every time I give a book talk, I encourage everybody, when you're in Monterey, demand to see the Vasquez adobe. Just go right in. The taxpayers own it. And the people there, they never heard of Vasquez. Even there's a sign on the outside that says Tiburcio Vasquez house. But I think if you go there, in my opinion, it's one of the most historic dwellings in California because it's part of a story that's been completely forgotten, shoved under the rug because it's not pretty. It's not totally about ranchero life. It's not about these pastoral Californios and their happy lifestyle. It's what happened afterwards when the Anglos came in and they became second-class citizens in their own land, and with the result, Tiburcio Vasquez being the best example of the result of that. Now, during Tiburcio's boyhood, the Mexican War took place. 1846. He was 11 years old. One of his uncles was killed by American rifle fire in one of the few armed conflicts in Northern California up by Novato at the Battle of Olampali. And then another uncle was killed in another battle in Natividad, which is just on the just kind of halfway between Monterey and Salinas. And during this time, the Californios lost their economic, political, and cultural power, and especially because as soon as the Mexican War was over, gold was discovered in January 1848, and there was an absolute flood of immigrants, 49ers, and the Californios quickly lost their ranchos. Not all of them, but most of them lost their land. They lost their political power, and like I said, became second-class citizens in their own land. Now, Monterey, during Tiburcio's boyhood, after 1848, 1849, was one of the most dangerous communities in American history. There were 40 murders in the space of 3 years in a county that only had 4,000 population. The FBI currently calculates homicide rates, homicides per 100,000. When you adjust that for population, that's 30 times the modern homicide rate. The modern homicide rate is about 5.5 murders per 100,000, and this is over 150 per 100,000. If this happened today, the local sheriff would be voted out of office, the police chief would be fired. Just imagine if your community had 30 murders in a year, and this community is much larger than 4,000 people. The reasons for this violence was that Monterey was a melting pot of all different ethnicities. You had Sydney Ducks from the Australian penal colony, American Indians, Californios, Mexicans who come up from Sonora, and Anglos. And the reason that they came to Monterey is that it had two things the mining region did not have. The mining region didn't have cattle, and all the cattle buyers and the butchers would get cattle from Monterey and have it driven up to the butcher towns in Marysville, Sacramento, and Stockton. And the cattle would be butchered and sent up to the mining camp region because there were several 100,000, by the early 1850s, several 100,000 miners up there, and most of the population was in the mining region with no agriculture and no food and no meat. The other thing Monterey had was women. California at this time was 98% male. And the reason for this violence, in my opinion, is the lack of women. When you put a bunch of young guys together with Colt firearms and booze and no women, they lose their manners. And that's happened for 10 years. Even by 1860, California was still 75% male. And so in the early years of the gold rush, almost all the women, the vast majority, were Latino. They were Californios. To a lesser extent, they were from Sonora who came up with their families. So there was a great deal of violence over gold and cattle and women. And in the midst of all this, Tiburcio decided to open up a dance hall in Monterey where he sold liquor, played Monte and other card games. There are many sailors in Monterey from the American frigates who loved to come into town and gamble. He had his fiancée who'd sing and dance and play the guitar. And so this put him into daily contact with the dregs of the community, with the most dangerous desperados and ruffians in California, many of whom had flocked to Monterey. And the other very dangerous community at that time was Los Angeles. Its homicide rate at times was even worse than Monterey's in the early 1850s. This is Tiburcio's exact quote over what led him into this life of outlawry. He said, "My career grew out of the circumstances by which I was surrounded. As I grew up to manhood, I was in the habit of attending balls and parties given by the native Californians, into which the Americans, then beginning to become numerous, would force themselves and shove the native-born men aside, monopolizing the dance and the women. This was about 1852. A spirit of hatred and revenge took possession of me. I had numerous fights in defense of what I believed to be my rights and those of my countrymen. I believe we were unjustly and wrongly deprived of the social rights that belonged to us. I went to my mother and told her I intended to commence a different life. I asked for and obtained her blessing and at once commenced the career of a robber." Now that was his story, and if you'll see when you read my book, when he told stories, there were always some truth and some untruths. He had a natural human inclination to place himself in the best light possible, and often in his life that was a little difficult to do. Did his mother actually give him permission to become a bandit? No, of course not. His mother, Doña Guadalupe Cantua de Vasquez, was a very devout woman from a very old Californio family. She attended Mass daily. There's accounts of her with her black rebozo over her head walking. She walked miles to Mass if she was staying with a family member outside of where the Mission Carmel is located. So it's very clear that she did not condone his life of crime, and nor did the other members of his family. He certainly, and as we'll see, he certainly had two sides to, there were two sides to this story, but I do want to point out that he had 6 brothers and sisters, all of whom, none of whom committed any kind of crimes, except some of them harbored him, which they can hardly be blamed for doing. His brother, Chico, was actually a justice of the peace for a time here in Los Angeles County. So these were respectable people. His other brother, Antonio Maria, was the head of the local school district in Carmel Valley near Mission Carmel in Monterey County. And his sisters in particular were very devoted to him. And like I said, the only crime they ever committed was supporting their brother. Now, at this time, Tiburcio fell under the influence of this notorious bandit chieftain named Anastasio Garcia. He was reputed to have killed 14 men. In 1854, Vasquez and Garcia got mixed up in a quarrel in a cantina in Monterey. A constable came in to quell the disturbance. The constable was shot and killed. There's many, many stories about what happened. Some accounts say Vasquez shot him. Some accounts say Garcia shot him. Some accounts say that their partner shot him. And in any event, Vasquez and Garcia escaped, and their partner, who was wounded in the gunfight, the next morning was lynched by a mob in front of this adobe. And according to some accounts, this fight took place in Tiburcio's dance hall. Now, the following year, Vasquez and Garcia got mixed up in the Roach-Belcher feud, which is the bloodiest feud of the California Gold Rush. It's way too complicated to tell the story, and if I tried to tell it, I'd get the factions all mixed up. It's that complicated. But what happened was Garcia was hired as a retainer or gunfighter to support one faction of the feud. One day, these two prominent politicians rode out of town, headed south toward Los Angeles, but the rumor got out that they were bringing gold to finance the opposite side of the feud. Tiburcio and Anastasio were seen following the two. They were later found shot to death along the Salinas River. And a famous Californio hero of the earlier battle that I mentioned, named Joaquin de la Torre, was the undersheriff then of Monterey County. He'd made peace with the Anglos. He was now politically important. He determined, at least in his own mind, and got warrants out for Anastasio Garcia. A large posse surrounded Garcia's adobe, and there was a huge gunfight. 3 of the posse were shot to death, including Under Sheriff Joaquin de la Torre. The posse men all saw a second guy in the adobe firing. There was so much gunfire coming out of the adobe, they knew it couldn't just be one guy shooting at them. And later, it was revealed that the other gunman inside the adobe was Tiburcio Vasquez. He was never charged with this offense because there was no evidence against him except for these stories and rumors that came out in later years. So Garcia fled to Los Angeles. He was captured by the sheriff of Los Angeles County, taken back up to Monterey, put in the Granite Jail, which ironically is directly across the street from the Vasquez adobe, and a mob came in and lynched him about a year after this. At about the same time, Tiburcio was arrested for cattle theft in Los Angeles County, not too far from where we are today. He was sent up to San Quentin. He spent about the next 6 years there. There, he helped organize 4 bloody prison breaks, which left 20 convicts dead. 2 of the prison breaks, very briefly, Vasquez and a bunch of other guys were loading brick on a schooner to be shipped out to market. They seized the crew and started to sail out into the bay, but the guards were prepared for this. They had 6-pound brass cannon loaded with canister shot, as well as grape shot, and they fired with the cannon, and the first rounds of cannon fire, which was canister shot, that was sent into the riggings, which is what the navies used to do back then. They'd fire canister, would knock all the riggings down. That kept the ship from going any farther. Then they just raked the ship with grape shot, and Vasquez, who had been trying to stab one of the overseer, the head guard, was overpowered actually by another prisoner who saved the guard's life. And I think 5 or 6 of the prisoners were shot and 3 or 4 were killed in that incident. San Quentin was highly insecure, very badly run prison. There were many, many prison breaks during this time period in the 1850s. And the last break Vasquez was involved in was the so-called Big Break of 1863, when some 300 prisoners broke out of the prison. And there have been so many prison breaks, they decided this time we're going to break out of the prison, then we're going to break back in, which is what they did. They broke into the armory, armed themselves to the teeth, and headed out towards San Rafael, and a huge posse trapped them, and there was a big gunfight, and Vasquez was captured, as was everybody else in that break. Those incidents started to bring Vasquez to the forefront as a leader, at least among the criminal population in the prisons. And that's where a lot of the outlaw gangs, then and now, criminals meet each other in prison and unfortunately become better criminals as a result of the education they get in prisons. And that was absolutely what happened back then. All of Tiburcio's bandit gangs consisted of either people he was related to by blood or marriage, or other Hispanics and Anglos that he met in San Quentin. After his final release from San Quentin in 1870, Tiburcio embarked on a prolific spree of banditry up and down the state from the Bay Area down to Los Angeles. He was a highly colorful character during this period. He was a great lover. He had many affairs with women. He was very handsome. He was a lady killer. In one instance, when he was fairly young, he eloped with a young girl from a rancho near what's now Livermore, in the Livermore Valley. And the father found, in the morning, the father had taken Vasquez in because he'd been injured in a fall from his horse. In one morning, Vasquez and his pretty daughter, who was about 16, were gone. And the ranchero, it didn't take a brain surgeon to figure out what happened to his daughter. So he caught up with them, shot Tiburcio in the arm, and recovered his daughter. In another incident, he made off in San Juan Bautista, which is one of his favorite hangouts in Northern California, which is in Monterey County. He took off with the wife of one of his gang members, Abelardo Salazar. And I wish that I could find photos of these women, but unfortunately I don't have them. But Salazar's photos in the book. He was a member of the Vasquez gang, and Vasquez claimed later that the girl, she was very young, 16 or 15, but his wife, the California women married very, very young back then. And Tiburcio claims she wanted to go with him. Another time he claimed that she really went with one of his gang members, not with him. But the husband certainly believed Vasquez had done it, so he encountered him in a gunfight right in front of the Mission San Juan and shot Vasquez through the lung. And he was near death by his own account for a long time after that. That was one of the many times he was shot and wounded. I think he had 6 or 8 gunshot wounds on him at the time of his final capture. Now, he was also very colorful in personality. I mean, he was very well read. He loved to read Spanish romantic novels. He spoke English and Spanish. In later life, his English was much more fluent than it was in his earlier years. But he attended school in Monterey. He wrote with a beautiful practiced hand. He was a famous dancer. This is why women loved him. He played the guitar, he sang, he wrote poetry for his female admirers. I even have some of his remaining poetry in one chapter in the book, translated into English, of course, because these were all Latina women that he was involved with. He also paid for food at the remote ranchos where he visited. He was seen during his own career as a Robin Hood character. The Hispanic community protected him and defended him, and we'll go into why in just a bit. Now, his popularity among both Anglos and Latinos started to go in decline, though, after the so-called Tres Pinos tragedy of 1873. And in that incident, the gang held up and robbed a store and a hotel located at what was then called Tres Pinos. It's now called Paisinas in Monterey County. And they killed 3 innocent people. Vasquez fired through a closed door as a man was shutting the door. The hotel keeper was killed by his rifle fire and fell dead in his wife's arms. And in the 19th century, if you killed an innocent person, if you killed a woman, you definitely get the death penalty if you weren't lynched. Violence against women, domestic violence was a problem, but if you killed a woman outside of your own family, many of those people were lynched for doing that. Women were very, as I mentioned, they were very scarce. Crimes against women were taken very, very seriously. And so this particular incident was really beyond the pale and eventually was important in the fate that he was about to meet. So large rewards were offered for Vasquez and his gang after the Tres Pinos tragedy. And in my book, I have a long account. I was going to read it, but I don't think I've got time to do it now. But of the manhunt. And what happened was, in brief, Sheriff John Adams was one of the best lawmen in California. This incident happened in the county adjacent to his county. He was out campaigning for re-election. He was in Gilroy, and the telegraph operator ran out in the morning after this raid and said there's been this horrible murder. Vasquez jumped on a freight car and went down to Hollister and tried to raise a posse, and he didn't, the people were too cowardly to join him. They were preparing fortifications to defend Hollister from the attack of the Vasquez gang. And Adams, who'd been a lawman for at least 10 years, was telling him, they're fleeing into the mountains. They're not coming to attack you. I want you to go with me. It took him till dark to just get 5 guys to go with him. And he later regretted not pushing on alone. And what he did was he trailed the outlaws on horseback from Tres Pinos all the way down, and this took a long time. This took some weeks, to what's now Little Rock Creek Reservoir over on the other side of the San Gabriels. And he and his gang, unbeknownst to Adams, the gang had gone up Little Rock Canyon and made camp up there. And Vasquez, at this time, was after the wife of one of his gang leaders named Abdon Leiva. And this had been a long long-standing policy of his, I guess. He didn't really care too much if the women he pursued were married or not. And they found him to be irresistible, I gotta say that for him. So he wanted to get his gang member, Abdon Leiva, out of camp. Leiva thought something was up, so he took a shortcut, came back to camp early and found Vasquez in bed, or bedrolls with his wife. So he drew a gun, he was gonna shoot Vasquez on the spot, but his Tiburcio's nephew and lieutenant overpowered Leiva. Leiva left camp, went up here to San Francisquito Canyon to a stage stop there named Delano Station, and actually an adobe's still there right next to where old Delano Station was. It's part of a private house today. And he surrendered to a deputy sheriff of Los Angeles County, and then later Sheriff Adams and Sheriff Billy Rowland came up and took the prisoner, and he made a full confession. And this is really the beginning of the end for Tiburcio Vasquez. The very next day after this incident happened, the gang pushed up a little bit farther up the canyon, and Rowland and Adams and their posse tracked the outlaws, followed the tracks of the horses, and they also had a wagon with them carrying loot from this robbery. And they trapped the gang at what's now called, I think it's called Basin Creek Campground. I've been up there, and if anybody, I went up there about 5 years ago, and I'd come all the way down here just to see Little Rock Creek. I wanted to see where the gunfight happened, see what it looked like. And I drove all the way to the very end of the parking lot at the Little Rock Creek Reservoir. And I get out of the car, and there's fences with barbed wire going like a half a mile across the whole canyon. And it said, warning, butterfly habitat or something like that. So my confession is, I didn't come all the way down to LA to be turned back by butterflies. So I climbed over or under the fence and went up and took photos, but by then it was half dark and none of the photos came out, and I didn't want to get arrested, so I never went back. But hopefully those butterfly fences aren't up there anymore. But you can actually go up and see where this gunfight happened. And in the book, I tell you exactly where it was. But in any event, they caught up with the posse. Vasquez and a couple of his men had the high ground. They opened fire. Captain Adams, Sheriff Adams, had been a Mexican War veteran, a captain of the volunteers in the Mexican War, had been in combat, had actually been in a lot of gunfights with outlaws in California, and he was yelling at the posse, follow me, follow me. None of them would. He finally charged on his own, but by that time, Vasquez and his men had gone. He was almost impossible to capture, very, very difficult. He was only captured a few times in his life. Considering all of the bandit raids and everything that he did for over a 20-year period. So that was after this gunfight at Little Rock Creek Canyon. Vasquez went back and got his wife, got Leiva's wife back, and by this time she was pregnant with his child. He eventually sent her back to her family in San Jose, or Milpitas, right near San Jose. Now, he stayed out of Los Angeles County for a number of months, and during that time he led bandit raids up and down the San Joaquin Valley. In the biggest raid, he and a large gang of about 15 outlaws raided the town of Kingston, which no longer exists. It's near Hanford in Kings County, and robbed the entire town. They tied up 30 or 40 or 50 people, robbed every business in town. Jesse James never did anything like that. He'd come in really quick, rob a bank, and get out. Vasquez was so brazen, he planned things like this, and right after that, his gang raided Visalia and started to do the same thing, but it was a Sunday, everybody was in church, they all poured out of the churches, got their guns, the church bells were ringing, and the gang wisely took off and gave up that raid. Now, in early 1874, Vasquez came back to Monterey County. In the meanwhile, Sheriff Harry Morse, who at that time was the most famous sheriff on the West Coast, was appointed by the governor to track down Vasquez, and the legislature offered a reward for Vasquez dead or alive, $6,000 reward, which is a fortune back in an era when people only made $50 a month. So Morse trailed the Vasquez gang for 2,700 miles, 60 days, one of the longest manhunts of the American West. Vasquez was forced to retreat out of his hideouts in the Coast Range and come back down to Los Angeles County, where he didn't have as strong friendship and family ties as he did in Northern California. He hid out at Greek George's adobe. There's a famous photograph of it that's in the book. It's located, there's all these kooky stories about where the adobe is located. When I was a younger attorney and had more energy, every time I had a court hearing in LA, I'd get in a rental car and I go to Hollywood and I take that photograph, and I did this like 5 times, and I drove the entire length of the Cahuengas, matching, trying to find the hills behind it. You can see the adobe with the distinctive hills behind, and the only place that remotely matches is, ironically enough, Melrose Place, same Melrose Place that you saw on TV, just a 2-block street of shishi stores and shops and that kind of thing, but that's where Greek George's adobe was located. How Vasquez was captured is another long story, but he was fooling around with about 3 different women all at the same time. There was a prostitute called La Coneja, the rabbit, and I'll leave it to your imagination to figure out why she had that nickname, but she was in Sonora Town in the Latino section, the northern part of LA, just north of the plaza, that was called Sonora Town. He was visiting her. It was mentioned in the newspapers. He was also seeing Greek George's sister. Greek George was married to Cornelia Lopez. His sister, Modesta Lopez, was a very attractive young woman in her early 30s. Tiburcio was seeing her. At the same time, he had seduced his niece, who, to her credit, she was the daughter of his brother. She had no idea. The brother, the same brother that later became a justice of the peace in Los Angeles County, did not tell his family who Tiburcio was, because I probably told him, look, I'll keep your secret, just please don't get my family into trouble. And the niece, like all women, she was 17 years old, she fell for him. He knew she was his niece, she had no idea, and she got pregnant. And so he now had a bunch of people mad at him. His own family. Greek George's sister was furious because she'd heard these stories about the niece who was pregnant. He lived in, the niece and the father, Chico Vasquez, lived in Soledad Canyon. And so somebody in the extended Lopez family snitched off Vasquez to Sheriff Rowland. Sheriff Rowland was half Latino. His mother was a native of New Mexico, a Latina woman. His father had come out here with a Wolfskill trapping party in the 1830s. So as a typical cultural thing, the children were essentially Latino. The mother controlled the domestic life. The children spoke English and Spanish, but principally Spanish. They were Catholic, and they were part of the Latino community. So Sheriff Rowland had he was a kind of a crossover sheriff. He had broad connections with both the Californio and Mexican population, as well as the Anglo population. They approached him, Greek George or somebody from Greek George's family, and in a combination of revenge and desire for the reward, they turned in Vasquez. Rowland sent a posse in, and actually Rowland initially got the information from Sheriff Morse, who he told him the info's no good, go back to Alameda, and Morse did, much to his regret, because it turned out the info Morse had gotten from the Lopez family first turned out to be correct. So Tiburcio was in fact captured. He tried to jump out a window. He was brought down by a load of buckshot, taken into LA. There was a nice article in the LA Times about my book about a month or so ago, and if you saw that whole story of what happened to him is told in the newspaper. And then he was taken up to Monterey, first to Salinas, which was then the county seat of Monterey County, then finally locked up in the jail in San Jose because the jury pools were considered to be too biased against him in Monterey County, same as the Messerly trial, had to send it down here. Things haven't changed that much today. And so, and he was convicted of murdering this hotel keeper who fell into his wife's arms, and was hanged in 1875 on the gallows that are right behind the courthouse that's still standing. The courthouse is still standing in San Jose. The jail yard was right behind it, and that's where he met his death. There's even a photo of the gallows in my book. So in summation, Tiburcio grew up in an era where Hispanics were discriminated against. Californios had lost their land and their political power. And when people are oppressed, they'll grasp at anything that gives them hope. Californios and Mexicans needed a man who could be held up as an avenger, who acted out their collective desire to resist a society which had marginalized them. In death, his legend grew even larger. And to many Hispanic Americans, Tiburcio Vasquez remains a powerful symbol of their ongoing struggle for ethnic, social, political, and economic equality. So in the end, was he a common criminal, or was he a rebel and a revolutionary? And you'll have to read the book if you want to figure that out.